Zektar's four eyes tracked the movement of cargo vessels through the viewing port of Station Nexus 7, his chitinous fingers tapping nervously against his communication tablet. As chief observer for the Galactic Coalition's Military Intelligence Division, he had witnessed countless species enter their first interstellar conflicts. The pattern was always the same. Initial bravado, followed by the harsh reality of space warfare. Then, either quick surrender or slow extinction. Today was different. Today, he was watching humanity prepare for war. The humans had been part of the Galactic Coalition for barely 3 standard cycles. Yet here they were, mobilizing for the largest conflict the galaxy had seen in over 2 centuries. The Kethmori Empire, a race of crystalline beings with technology that bordered on the mystical, had declared war on the Coalition after decades of territorial disputes. Their fleets had already consumed 12 star systems, turning entire worlds into lifeless crystal formations that served as monuments to their conquest. "Sir," Lieutenant Vashti's voice crackled through the intercom, her serpentine form visible on the communication screen. "The human fleet has just dropped out of hyperspace. You need to see this." Zektar's mandibles clicked in what his species considered mild amusement. He had read the reports about human military capabilities. Impressive for such a young species, certainly, but hardly remarkable compared to the established powers of the galaxy. Their technology was functional but unremarkable, their ships sturdy but unrefined. What could possibly warrant such urgency in Vashti's tone? He activated the long-range sensors and felt his secondary heart skip a beat. The human fleet wasn't what he had expected. Intelligence reports had suggested they would bring perhaps 200 vessels, a respectable force for a species so new to galactic warfare. Instead, his sensors were detecting over 800 ships, ranging from sleek destroyers to massive vessels that dwarfed anything in the Coalition's current arsenal. But it wasn't the size of the fleet that made Zektar's exoskeleton chill with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. It was how they moved. Every other species in the galaxy approached warfare with a certain predictable methodology. The Altarians favored elegant formations that maximized their energy weapons efficiency. The Corvin used swarm tactics, overwhelming enemies with sheer numbers. The Zelthani relied on technological superiority, their ships bristling with experimental weapons that could tear holes in reality itself. The humans moved like nothing he had ever seen. Their fleet formations seemed chaotic at first glance, ships scattered in seemingly random patterns that violated every principle of military doctrine Zektar had studied in his 3 decades of service. Yet as he watched longer, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't chaos. It was something far more sophisticated. The humans were moving in 3-dimensional formations that constantly shifted, creating overlapping fields of fire while maintaining multiple escape routes. "Give me Admiral Thrakven," Zektar commanded, his voice carrying more tension than he intended. The screen flickered, revealing the scarred visage of the Coalition's supreme military commander. Thrakven was a Brutari, a species whose entire culture revolved around warfare. His people had been fighting galactic conflict for over 5,000 years, and his tactical brilliance was legendary throughout known space. "Admiral," Zektar began, "the human fleet has arrived. I think you need to see their formations." Thrakven's 6 eyes narrowed as he studied the tactical display Zektar transmitted. For several long moments, the Admiral said nothing, his massive frame motionless as he processed what he was seeing. "Impossible," Thrakven finally growled, his voice like grinding stone. "No species develops these tactics naturally. This level of 3-dimensional thinking typically requires centuries of space warfare experience. Sir, our intelligence reports indicate that humans have been engaged in space combat for less than 50 standard years, and most of that was limited to conflicts within their own solar system." "Then, explain this," Thrakven demanded, highlighting a section of the formation where human ships were performing maneuvers that seemed to defy conventional tactical wisdom. This formation provides optimal coverage against attacks from 17 different vectors simultaneously, while maintaining mobility for rapid repositioning. The mathematical complexity alone would challenge our best strategists. Zektar enhanced the sensor readings, focusing on individual ships. What he saw made his primary stomach clench with unease. The human vessels weren't just moving in formation. They were communicating with each other at a rate that seemed impossible. Thousands of microtransmissions flowed between ships every second, creating a network that appeared to function as a single massive organism rather than individual units. Admiral, are you seeing these communication patterns? I am. Thrakvin's tone had shifted from confusion to something approaching concern. They're sharing tactical data in real time across their entire fleet. The processing power required for that kind of coordination should be beyond any single species' computational abilities. As they watched, a new development caught their attention. A small group of human ships, perhaps 24 destroyers, suddenly broke away from the main formation and began accelerating toward the edge of the system. Their trajectory made no tactical sense. They were heading directly toward empty space, far from any strategic objectives. What are they doing? Zektar muttered, adjusting sensors to track the breakaway group. The answer came 3 standard hours later, when sensors detected the arrival of a Kethmori scouting force at the exact coordinates the human ships had been approaching. The Crystal Beings' vessels dropped out of hyperspace directly into a carefully prepared ambush. Zektar watched in stunned silence as the human destroyers engaged the Kethmori scouts with a precision that defied explanation. The crystal ships, renowned for their defensive capabilities, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Human weapons, which intelligence reports had classified as adequate but unremarkable, tore through Kethmori defenses like they had been specifically designed for the task. How do they know? Zektar whispered. Thrakvin was studying tactical readouts with an expression Zektar had never seen on the Admiral's face before, genuine bewilderment. The Kethmori scouts weren't detected by any of our sensors until they arrived. Somehow, the humans anticipated their exact arrival point and timing. The engagement lasted less than 10 standard minutes. When it was over, the Kethmori scouting force had been completely destroyed, while the human destroyers hadn't lost a single vessel. Even more unsettling, the human ships immediately began implementing salvage operations, efficiently stripping technology and materials from the destroyed crystal vessels with a practiced ease that suggested they had done this many times before. Pull up the humans' military history, Thrakvin ordered. Everything we have. Zektar's fingers flew over his interface, accessing files that had been compiled during humanity's integration into the coalition. What he found made him question whether their intelligence gathering had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Sir, according to our records, humans have been engaged in continuous warfare throughout their recorded history. Not just occasional conflicts, constant, unending warfare. Their historical databases indicate over 14,000 distinct military engagements in just their recent past. 14,000? Thrakvin's voice carried a note of disbelief. In how long a period? Approximately 1,000 standard years, sir. The Admiral's silence stretched uncomfortably long. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful in a way that made Zektar's exoskeleton tingle with apprehension. That averages to more than 1 significant military engagement every month for a millennium. No species sustains that level of conflict without either destroying itself, or... He paused, as if reluctant to voice his conclusion. Or becoming something fundamentally different, Zektar finished quietly. The communication screen flickered as new data streams began flowing in from the human fleet. Zektar found himself studying ship designs that suddenly made terrifying sense when viewed through this new lens. What coalition analysts had dismissed as crude, functional engineering was actually the product of constant refinement through endless conflict. Every design element had been tested in battle, refined through necessity, and improved through the harsh lessons of survival. Human weapons weren't remarkable because they were powerful. They were remarkable because they were reliable. Human ships weren't impressive because they were elegant. They were impressive because they could continue fighting long after any reasonable expectation of survival. Human tactics weren't sophisticated because of advanced theory. They were sophisticated because they had been developed through 10,000 years of refinement in the crucible of constant warfare. Admiral, Zektar said slowly, I think we've been asking the wrong questions about humanity. Explain. We've been wondering how a young species could be so capable in warfare. But what if they're not young at warfare? What if they're older at it than any species in the galaxy? Thrakvin studied the tactical displays with new understanding. You're suggesting that while other species developed civilization, humans developed war. I'm suggesting that for humans, war is their civilization. As if summoned by their conversation, a new communication channel opened. The screen displayed the face of a human admiral, Admiral Sarah Chun, according to the identification protocols. She appeared remarkably calm for someone commanding a fleet entering a war zone that had already claimed billions of lives. Admiral Thrakvin, Observer Zektar, she said, her voice carrying an easy confidence that somehow felt more unsettling than if she had been nervous. We've completed our preliminary reconnaissance of the operational area. We're ready to begin Phase 1 of our campaign plan. Phase 1, Thrakvin asked. Admiral Chin's smile was small and cold. Isolation and disruption of Keth Mori supply lines. We've identified 47 strategic choke points that will effectively cut their fleet off from reinforcement. Our timeline for completing these objectives is 6 standard days. Zektar felt his breathing apparatus constrict. Admiral, those 47 systems span a volume of space larger than most galactic sectors. The logistics alone have been accounted for, Chin interrupted smoothly. We've already dispatched hunter groups to 17 of the target systems. The remaining 30 will be addressed over the next 4 days. The casual way she discussed operations that should have taken months to plan and execute sent a chill through Zektar's circulatory system. How long have you been planning this campaign? Since we first learned of the Keth Mori threat, Chin replied. Approximately 2 standard years ago. Thrakvin leaned forward. 2 years? But the conflict only began 6 months ago. Chin's expression didn't change. Admiral, the conflict began the moment the Keth Mori decided to expand into coalition space. Everything since then has just been them catching up to that reality. The transmission ended, leaving Zektar and Thrakvin staring at a blank screen. Outside the viewing port, the human fleet was already beginning to disperse, groups of ships disappearing in a hyperspace with a coordination that spoke of exhaustive preparation. Zektar, Thrakvin said finally, I want you to compile a new intelligence assessment on humanity. Include everything, their history, their culture, their psychology. I have a feeling we've been fundamentally misunderstanding what we're dealing with. What should I focus on, sir? Thrakvin was quiet for a long moment, watching the last human ships vanish into the void. Focus on this question. What kind of species spends 2 years planning for a war that hadn't started yet? Zektar spent the next several hours poring over human cultural databases, historical records, and psychological profiles. What he found painted a picture of a species unlike any other in the galaxy. While most civilizations had periods of warfare followed by periods of peace, humans seemed to exist in a constant state of preparation for conflict. Their literature was filled with strategic thinking, their games often involved tactical challenges, and their entertainment frequently centered around themes of conflict and survival. But it was their reaction to the concept of peace that truly unsettled him. In human culture, peace wasn't seen as the natural state of affairs. It was seen as a temporary condition that required constant vigilance to maintain. They didn't hope for peace. They prepared for its inevitable end. As night's cycle began on Station Nexus 7, Zektar found himself staring out at the stars where the human fleet had disappeared. Somewhere in the darkness, they were beginning a campaign that would determine the fate of the galaxy. And for the first time in his long career, he found himself wondering if the Coalition truly understood what they had allied themselves with. The Keth Mori Empire had spent decades becoming a terror that made entire species flee their homeworlds rather than face crystalline conquest. They had technology that could rewrite matter at the molecular level, and ships that seemed to shrug off weapons that would vaporize mountains. But as Zektar compiled his growing dossier on humanity, one thought kept returning to trouble his sleep. What happened when an unstoppable force met a species that had never learned how to stop fighting? The answer, he suspected, was about to reshape the galaxy in ways none of them could imagine. And, deep in his composite heart, Zektar began to understand why every species in the galaxy would learn to fear the quiet efficiency with which humans approached the business of war. 3 days had passed since the human fleet dispersed into the void, and Zektar found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about warfare. His enhanced communication array buzzed constantly with reports from across the sector, each one more impossible than the last. Sir, Vashti's voice carried a tremor that was unusual for her species. We're receiving confirmation from the Kepler 442 system. The human assault on the Keth Mori supply depot was successful. Zektar's mandibles clicked in confusion. That's impossible. Kepler 442 is a fortress world. The Kethmori have been building those defenses for decades. Our projections indicated it would take at least 50 coalition dreadnoughts and acceptable losses of 60% to breach their perimeter. Sir, the humans took it with 12 ships. No losses. The numbers made no sense. Zektar pulled up the tactical analysis of Kepler 442's defenses. The system was protected by crystalline defense platforms that could channel stellar energy into weapons capable of destroying entire fleets. The Kethmori had turned 3 of the system's moons into fortress stations, each bristling with weapons that had never been overcome by conventional assault. How? He asked simply. Vash-TI transmitted the reconnaissance data captured by long-range sensors. Zektar watched the feeds with growing amazement as he witnessed the human assault unfold. The humans hadn't attacked the defenses at all. Instead, they had done something that no military strategist in galactic history had ever attempted. They had infiltrated the system's star itself. Somehow, the humans had managed to insert specialized vessels into the stellar corona, ships that seemed designed to withstand temperatures that should have vaporized any known material. From within the star, they had deployed devices that disrupted the stellar energy collection systems that powered the entire Kethmori defensive network. They starved the defenses, Zektar whispered in amazement. Rather than trying to overcome the weapons, they removed their power source. But that was only the beginning. With the primary defenses offline, human ships had emerged from hyperspace at coordinates that should have been impossible to calculate. They had appeared inside the defensive perimeter, bypassing the fortress installations entirely. The Kethmori defenders found themselves fighting an enemy that had somehow materialized in their most secure zones. The engagement itself had lasted less than 2 standard hours. Human ground forces had deployed to the surface using insertion techniques that seemed to violate basic physics. Instead of traditional dropships, they had used what appeared to be individual atmospheric entry pods, each carrying a single soldier who somehow survived insertion velocities that should have created massive impact craters. Zektar enhanced the surface combat footage and felt his secondary heart stop. Human soldiers moved across the battlefield like nothing he had ever seen. They didn't advance in formation. They flowed like a liquid organism, each individual warrior acting with perfect awareness of every other member of their unit. Their weapons were precise, their movements economical, and their coordination absolutely seamless. But what truly disturbed Zektar was their faces. He had witnessed countless species in combat, and the physiological responses were universal. Fear, adrenaline, excitement, rage, all manifested in predictable ways across different biologies. The humans showed none of these responses. They moved with a calm, methodical efficiency that suggested they found warfare as natural as breathing. Vash-TI, he said slowly, access the battlefield recordings and focus on individual human soldiers. I need psychological analysis of their combat stress responses. The analysis returned results that made Zektar question the reliability of his instruments. Human soldiers showed stress indicators that were consistent with routine physical exercise, not life-or-death combat. Their heart rates were elevated but stable. Their brain activity patterns suggested focused attention rather than fear-induced hypervigilance. And their endocrine systems showed none of the chemical cascades associated with combat trauma. They're enjoying this, Vash-TI said quietly. No, Zektar corrected, though the realization chilled him. They're comfortable with this. This is normal for them. Admiral Throckven's communication came through as Zektar was reviewing the psychological data. The Brutari commander looked haggard, his usually perfect military bearing showing signs of strain. Observer Zektar, I need your assessment of human tactical doctrine. We've received reports from 17 different engagements across the sector, and none of them follow any recognizable pattern. Zektar transmitted the data he had compiled. Admiral, I don't think humans have a doctrine in the way we understand the concept. They seem to approach each engagement as a unique problem requiring a unique solution. Explain. At Kepler 442, they neutralized fixed defenses by disrupting their power source. At the Tau Ceti mining operation, they used the asteroid field itself as weapons, redirecting mining charges to create a directed explosive field. At Wolf 359, they somehow convinced the Kethmori garrison to surrender without firing a shot. Throckven's expression grew more troubled. How does a species develop that level of tactical flexibility? By never fighting the same war twice, Zektar replied. I've been studying human historical conflicts, Admiral. They don't just adapt to their enemies. They seem to actively avoid repeating successful strategies. It's as if they deliberately make warfare more difficult for themselves. That makes no sense from an evolutionary perspective. Unless the evolution wasn't biological, Zektar said slowly, as a new theory began to form. Admiral, what if human warfare evolution is cultural rather than genetic? What if they've developed a civilization that treats conflict as a puzzle to be solved rather than a problem to be overcome? Before Thrakvin could respond, new alarms began sounding throughout Station Nexus 7. Zektar's display flashed with incoming emergency transmissions from across the sector. Report, Thrakvin commanded. Vashti's image appeared, her serpentine features displaying unprecedented agitation. Sir, we're receiving distress signals from Kethmori forces across 12 systems simultaneously. They're requesting immediate evacuation support from the Galactic Neutral Zone Authority. Evacuation? Zektar's voice carried disbelief. The Kethmori don't retreat. Their military doctrine forbids withdrawal under any circumstances. Sir, they're not retreating, Vashti clarified. They're fleeing. The distinction sent a chill through Zektar's exoskeleton. Military retreat was a tactical decision made by commanders to preserve forces for future engagement. Flight was a psychological response driven by existential terror. What are the humans doing to them? Thrakvin asked. The answer came from an unexpected source. Captain Veltar, a Kethmori officer who had somehow escaped the human assault on the Rigel system, transmitted a desperate communication to Coalition headquarters. His crystalline form was flickering with stress patterns that indicated complete psychological breakdown. They don't fight like any species we've encountered, Veltar's transmission began, his voice carrying harmonics of pure terror. They don't just defeat us, they study us. Every engagement, they learn something new about our capabilities and weaknesses. But, more than that, they seem to understand us better than we understand ourselves. Zektar enhanced the audio filters to better translate Kethmori emotional resonances. What he heard made his breathing apparatus constrict with sympathetic fear. At Rigel, they didn't just attack our positions, Veltar continued. They attacked our psychology. They used our own tactical doctrines against us, turning our strengths into weaknesses. They made us afraid of our own capabilities. How? Progbendimandith. They created scenarios where our standard responses would result in destroying our own forces. When we tried to use our matter conversion weapons, they had positioned themselves so that our shots would tear through our own supply lines. When we attempted to establish crystal growth fortifications, they had somehow contaminated the base materials so that our own defenses became traps. Zektar felt a cold understanding beginning to form. Captain Veltar, how long were the humans observing your forces before they attacked? We detected them 6 standard hours before the assault began. But Veltar's crystalline form flickered with confusion. They fought as if they had been studying us for cycles. They knew our formations, our communication protocols, our individual commanders' tactical preferences. 6 hours, Zektar whispered. They learned your entire military structure in 6 hours. Thrakvin was studying tactical displays with an expression of growing unease. Observer, pull up comparative data on human intelligence gathering capabilities versus other species. The results were staggering. While most species required months or years to develop effective counter-strategies against new opponents, humans seemed capable of analyzing and adapting to enemy tactics in real time. Their learning curve wasn't just faster, it was exponentially faster. Admiral, Zektar said slowly, I think we need to consider the possibility that humans don't just fight wars differently. They think about warfare in fundamentally different ways than any species we've encountered. Elaborate. Most species develop military doctrine based on their own capabilities and limitations. Humans seem to develop doctrine based on their enemy's capabilities and limitations. They don't ask, how can we use our strengths? They ask, how can we exploit your weaknesses? As if summoned by their conversation, Admiral Chen's image appeared on the communication screen. She looked exactly as calm and composed as she had 3 days earlier, despite commanding operations across dozens of star systems simultaneously. Admiral Thrakvin, Observer Zektar, she said with that same unsettling smile. We've completed Phase 1 of our operational plan. All 47 strategic choke points have been secured, and Kethmori supply lines have been effectively severed. All 47. Thrakvin's voice carried disbelief. Admiral, that should have taken months to accomplish. Time efficiency increases when you're not constrained by conventional tactical thinking, Chen replied. We're now ready to begin Phase 2, which involves systematic dismantling of Keth-Mori command structure. We've identified all primary decision-makers in their military hierarchy and developed individualized approaches for neutralizing each one. Zektar felt his exoskeleton chill. Admiral, are you talking about assassination? Chen's expression showed mild surprise. Observer, why would we eliminate enemy commanders when we can turn them to our advantage? Dead leaders are replaced by new leaders. Compromised leaders continue making decisions that serve our objectives. The implications of her statement settled over the conversation like a dark cloud. Zektar found himself wondering if humans truly understood the ethical boundaries that govern civilized warfare, or if they had simply chosen to ignore them. Admiral Chun, Thrakvin said carefully, the Galactic Convention on Military Ethics expressly prohibits the manipulation of enemy command personnel through psychological warfare. Admiral Thrakvin, Chin replied with that same disturbing calm. The Galactic Convention was written by species who believe warfare should be civilized. Humans have never shared that assumption. The transmission ended, leaving Zektar and Thrakvin in stunned silence. Outside the viewing port, space looked exactly as it always had. Vast, empty, and peaceful. But Zektar now understood that appearances could be deceiving. Somewhere in that apparent emptiness, humanity was rewriting the rules of galactic conflict. Admiral, he said quietly, I think we need to seriously consider whether we want to win this war. Thrakvin turned to look at him. Explain. If humans are capable of dismantling the Keth-Mori Empire this quickly and efficiently, what does that say about their capabilities against any opponent? Today, they're our allies. But what happens when our interests no longer align? The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither wanted to fully explore. The Galactic Coalition had invited humanity to join their alliance, believing they were gaining a useful but manageable ally. Now, Zektar was beginning to suspect they had awakened something that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the galaxy. And the most terrifying part was that the humans seemed to have anticipated this exact outcome from the beginning. Admiral Chen's prediction about Phase 2 proved accurate, with a precision that bordered on prophetic. Over the following week, Zektar watched in fascination and growing horror as the human fleet systematically dismantled the Keth-Mori command structure without firing a single shot at their leadership. The first domino fell when General Krextil, Supreme Commander of the Keth-Mori Third Fleet, received what appeared to be routine intelligence reports about human movements. The reports were accurate, detailed, and completely authentic. They were also carefully selected to create a specific pattern of misinformation. Zektar watched the psychological manipulation unfold through intercepted communications. Each report Krextil received was factually correct, but when viewed together, they painted a picture of human fleet movements that suggested a massive assault on the Vega system. The general, operating with the best intelligence available to him, deployed 70% of his forces to defend what he believed was humanity's primary objective. The humans never went near Vega. Instead, they struck at 17 different systems simultaneously, encountering minimal resistance, because Krextil had concentrated his forces defending empty space. By the time the Keth-Mori commander realized he had been manipulated, his scattered remaining forces were isolated and vulnerable. How did they know? Vashti asked as they reviewed the tactical recordings. How did they predict exactly how General Krextil would interpret their movements? Zektar was beginning to develop a theory that disturbed him more with each passing hour. They didn't predict his response. They engineered it. Sir, look at these intelligence reports the humans allowed the Keth-Mori to intercept. Each piece of information is true, but the pattern they create together is false. The humans didn't just feed misinformation to their enemy. They created a logical framework that forced Krextil to reach the wrong conclusion using accurate data. The implications were staggering. Traditional military deception involved providing false information and hoping the enemy would believe it. Humans had created a form of deception that worked even when the enemy correctly analyzed truthful information. They had turned logic itself into a weapon. But Krextil's manipulation was only the beginning. Admiral Yethmor, commander of the Keth-Mori defensive installations in the Centauri sector, began receiving communications that appeared to come from her own intelligence services. The messages were perfectly formatted, used correct authentication codes, and contained information that only legitimate Kethmori sources should have possessed. The communications gradually began suggesting that certain members of Yethmor's staff were providing information to human forces. The evidence was subtle but compelling: tactical decisions that seemed to benefit human objectives, supply routing that created vulnerabilities in Kethmori defenses, communication delays that allowed human forces to escape encirclement. Within 2 standard days, Admiral Yethmor had arrested half her senior staff on suspicion of treason. The Kethmori command structure began consuming itself, with officers turning against each other in an escalating spiral of paranoia and mistrust. Admiral Thrakven, Zektar said as he compiled his latest intelligence assessment, "I need to show you something disturbing." The Brutari commander appeared on screen, his expression haggard with fatigue. The past week had aged him visibly as reports of human tactical innovations flooded in from across the sector. "What is it, Observer?" "Sir, I've been analyzing the human psychological warfare campaign against Kethmori leadership. I believe they've developed a form of manipulation that's unprecedented in galactic warfare." Zektar transmitted his findings, watching Thrakven's expression shift from confusion to understanding to something approaching horror. "They're not just attacking the Kethmori military structure," the Admiral said slowly. "They're attacking the concept of trust itself." "Yes, sir. Traditional psychological warfare attempts to convince enemies to make poor decisions. Human psychological warfare creates conditions where any decision the enemy makes serves human objectives." Thrakven studied the data for several long moments. "Observer, in your assessment, how long would it take humans to develop similar campaigns against coalition leadership?" The question sent a chill through Zektar's circulatory system. He had been so focused on admiring human tactical innovation that he hadn't considered its implications for coalition security. "Sir, based on the speed with which they analyzed Kethmori command structure, I estimate they could develop similar operations against any coalition species within a matter of days." "Days?" Thrakven's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Sir, humans seem to possess an intuitive understanding of how different species process information and make decisions. It's as if they've spent their entire evolutionary history learning to predict and manipulate the behavior of other intelligent beings." Before Thrakven could respond, new alarms began sounding throughout Station Nexus 7. Zektar's display flashed with urgent communications from the front lines. "Report," Thrakven commanded. Vashti's image appeared, her serpentine features displaying unprecedented excitement. "Sir, we're receiving surrender requests from the entire Kethmori Fifth Fleet. Over 300 vessels requesting immediate amnesty under the Galactic Convention on Military Prisoners." Zektar's mandibles clicked in confusion. "The Fifth Fleet? But they weren't even under attack." "Sir, that's correct. They're surrendering preemptively." The impossibility of the situation struck Zektar like a physical blow. Military forces didn't surrender unless they were defeated or facing certain destruction. For an entire fleet to surrender without engagement suggested something had fundamentally broken their will to fight. "Give me fleet communications," Thrakven ordered. "I want to speak with whoever is commanding the Fifth Fleet." The screen flickered, revealing Admiral Zethkri, a Kethmori officer whose crystalline form pulsed with patterns of absolute despair. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made Zektar's translator struggle to process the emotional undertones. "Coalition Admiral," Zethkri began, "I request formal surrender of all forces under my command. We cannot continue this conflict. Admiral, you haven't engaged human forces. Your fleet is intact and fully operational." "No," Zethkri replied, his crystalline form flickering with stress patterns. "You don't understand. They sent us a message." "What kind of message?" Zethkri transmitted the communication his fleet had received. Zektar opened the file and found himself staring at what appeared to be a simple tactical analysis of the Fifth Fleet's capabilities and deployment patterns. The document was thorough, accurate, and completely factual. It contained no threats, no demands, and no ultimatums. It was the most terrifying communication Zektar had ever read. The human analysis didn't just identify the Fifth Fleet's weaknesses. It provided detailed explanations of exactly how those weaknesses could be exploited. It outlined 17 different scenarios for the fleet's complete destruction, along with probability calculations, casualty estimates, and timeline projections. The document read like an academic exercise, presented with the clinical detachment of a scientific paper. But what made it truly horrifying was its accuracy. Every weakness identified was real, every exploitation method was feasible, and every projection was mathematically sound. The humans had analyzed the Fifth Fleet with such thoroughness that they understood its capabilities better than its own commanders. They showed us exactly how they would destroy us, Zeth Kree continued, his voice carrying notes of existential despair. Not threats, not boasts, technical specifications. They analyzed our fleet like we were an engineering problem to be solved. Zektar felt his breathing apparatus constrict. Admiral, did they demand your surrender? No. They simply sent the analysis and waited. They let us reach our own conclusions about the futility of resistance. The psychological sophistication was breathtaking. Rather than threatening the Kethmori fleet, humans had provided them with all the information necessary to understand the hopelessness of their situation. They had turned the enemy's own intelligence against them, forcing them to confront the mathematical certainty of their defeat. Admiral Zeth Kree, Thrakven said carefully, what convinced you that the human projections were accurate? Because they included detailed analysis of our defensive capabilities alongside their exploitation methods. They didn't just show us how they would attack. They showed us how our responses would be anticipated and countered. Every tactical doctrine we've developed over centuries of warfare, they had already analyzed and developed countermeasures for. Zektar found himself studying the human analysis with growing understanding. This wasn't just psychological warfare. It was something far more sophisticated. The humans had created a form of communication that forced their enemies to accept the logic of defeat without coercion or deception. Sir, he said to Thrakven, I think we need to understand that humans don't just fight wars, they solve them. Explain. Every other species in the galaxy approaches warfare as a conflict between opposing forces. Humans approach warfare as a problem with optimal solutions. They don't seek to defeat their enemies through superior force. They seek to demonstrate that resistance itself is logically indefensible. The communication screen flickered as Admiral Chen's image appeared. She looked exactly as calm and composed as always, despite having just induced the surrender of an entire enemy fleet without firing a shot. Admiral Thrakven, Observer Zektar, she said with her characteristic unsettling smile. We've successfully completed Phase 2 of our operational plan. Kethmori command structure has been effectively neutralized. Admiral, Thrakven said slowly, your psychological warfare capabilities are unlike anything we've encountered. How did humanity develop these techniques? Chen's expression showed mild surprise. Admiral, these aren't psychological warfare techniques. This is simply how humans approach any complex problem. We analyze all variables, identify optimal solutions, and implement the most efficient path to resolution. But the manipulation of enemy decision-making processes isn't manipulation, Chen interrupted. We're providing accurate information and allowing our opponents to make rational decisions based on complete data. If they choose surrender after understanding their situation, that's logical rather than coercive. Zektar felt a chill run through his exoskeleton as he realized the implications of Chen's words. Humans didn't see their actions as warfare at all. They saw them as problem-solving. The complete psychological destruction of enemy forces wasn't a military tactic. It was simply the most efficient solution to the problem of armed resistance. Admiral Chen, he said carefully, what is Phase 3? Chen's smile grew slightly wider. Resolution. We've isolated enemy forces, neutralized their command structure, and demonstrated the futility of continued resistance. Now we implement optimal solutions for integrating former enemy assets into productive roles within the galactic community. Integration. The Kethmori Empire possesses significant technological and resource capabilities. Rather than destroying these assets, we'll be incorporating them into coalition infrastructure. Former enemy personnel will be offered opportunities to contribute their expertise to peaceful endeavors. The casual way she discussed the complete reorganization of an entire galactic empire sent chills through both observers. Humans weren't just winning the war. They were treating the Kethmori Empire like a business acquisition. And if they refuse? Thrakven asked. Chen's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Admiral, We've demonstrated the mathematical certainty of our capabilities. Refusal would be an irrational choice, and we found that most species make rational decisions when provided with complete information. The transmission ended, leaving Zektar and Thrakven in contemplative silence. Outside the viewing port, space looked peaceful and empty, but Zektar now understood that appearances were deceptive. Somewhere in that void, humanity was reshaping the galaxy according to principles that no other species had ever conceived. "Admiral," Zektar said quietly, "I think we need to seriously reconsider our relationship with humanity." "In what way?" "We invited them into the coalition as allies. But I'm beginning to suspect that humans don't form alliances, they create dependencies. Every species that works with them becomes more efficient, more capable, and more integrated into human operational frameworks." Thrakven studied the tactical displays showing human fleet movements across the sector. "You're suggesting that humanity is using the coalition for its own purposes." "I'm suggesting that humanity sees the coalition as a problem to be optimized, and they're implementing their optimal solution. The question is whether we're partners in that solution or simply variables to be managed." The question hung between them, carrying implications that neither wanted to fully explore. The galaxy had thought it was gaining a powerful ally in humanity. Now, as Zektar watched human efficiency reshape the balance of power across known space, he wondered if they had actually invited their eventual masters to take control. Phase 3 began with a level of precision that made Zektar question whether humans possessed some form of precognitive abilities. Within hours of Admiral Chen's announcement, human vessels began appearing at strategic locations throughout former Kethmori space. They didn't arrive as conquerors or occupiers. They came as administrators. Zektar watched through long-range sensors as human ships established orbital platforms around key worlds with an efficiency that suggested they had been planning these operations for years. Each platform was perfectly positioned to coordinate resource distribution, facilitate communication networks, and provide logistical support for the massive humanitarian operation that was beginning to unfold. "Sir," Vashti reported, her voice carrying a note of amazement, "human forces are providing medical aid to Kethmori civilian populations. They're treating injuries from the conflict they just caused." "Of course they are," Zektar muttered, though the efficiency of the operation continued to astound him. Human medical teams seemed to understand Kethmori physiology better than some Kethmori doctors, deploying treatments that addressed not just physical trauma, but the unique psychological stress patterns of crystalline beings. Admiral Thrakven appeared on the communication screen, his expression reflecting the mixture of admiration and unease that had become common among coalition leadership. "Observer," he said without preamble, "I've received a request from Admiral Chen. She wants to address the Coalition High Command about post-conflict integration procedures." Integration procedures? Apparently, humans have developed comprehensive protocols for incorporating former enemy populations into galactic civilization. She's offering to share these protocols with all Coalition species. Zektar felt his secondary hearts skip irregularly. The implications were staggering. Humans weren't just offering to help with the Kethmori situation. They were positioning themselves as experts in civilizational integration, a field that had traditionally required centuries of diplomatic negotiation and cultural exchange. "Admiral, have you reviewed these protocols?" "I have." Thrakven's expression grew more troubled. "Observer, they're remarkable. Comprehensive psychological assessment frameworks, economic transition models, cultural preservation guidelines. Everything necessary to successfully integrate an entire civilization into galactic society." "How long did it take them to develop these protocols?" According to Admiral Chun, they've had them prepared for over a year. The timeline sent chills through Zektar's exoskeleton. Humans had been preparing integration protocols for the Kethmori Empire before the war had even begun. They hadn't just planned for victory. They had planned for the complete reorganization of enemy society. "Sir, may I suggest that we need to understand how humans develop these long-term strategic frameworks? Their ability to anticipate and prepare for complex scenarios seems to exceed any known species' capabilities." "I've been thinking the same thing," Thrakven replied. "I want you to attend Admiral Chen's presentation to the High Command. Your assessment of human strategic thinking may be crucial for Coalition security." 2 days later, Zektar found himself in the Coalition's primary conference chamber, surrounded by representatives from dozens of species who had gathered to hear humanity's proposal for galactic integration protocols. Admiral Chun stood before them with the same calm confidence she had displayed throughout the conflict, but Zektar noticed something different in her bearing, a sense of anticipation that suggested she was about to reveal something significant. Honored representatives, Chun began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's translation systems. Humanity appreciates the opportunity to share our experiences with civilizational integration. Over the past several years, we've developed frameworks that we believe can benefit all coalition species. Counselor Vexthal of the Altarian Assembly leaned forward in his gravity pod. Admiral, our records indicate that humans have limited experience with large-scale integration projects. How were you able to develop such comprehensive protocols? Chen's smile carried that same unsettling quality that had become familiar to Zektar. Counselor, human civilization has been dealing with integration challenges for our entire recorded history. We've simply adapted our existing frameworks to galactic scale. Could you elaborate on these existing frameworks? This question came from Chancellor Mordek of the Xylorian Confederation, her crystalline voice carrying skeptical harmonics. Certainly, Chun activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber. Human civilization consists of thousands of distinct cultural groups, each with unique languages, customs, belief systems, and social structures. Throughout our history, we've developed methods for allowing these groups to maintain their individual identities while participating in larger collaborative frameworks. The display showed a complex web of interconnected systems that represented human civilization. Zektar studied the pattern with growing amazement. What he had assumed was a single, unified culture was actually a vast network of distinct societies that somehow functioned as a cohesive whole. For example, Chen continued, our current global government incorporates governance models from over 200 different cultural traditions. Our economic systems blend capitalist, socialist, and resource-sharing frameworks depending on local conditions and preferences. Our educational systems preserve thousands of distinct knowledge traditions while facilitating universal skill development. Counselor Thane of the Draconic Imperium raised a clawed appendage. Admiral, this level of cultural integration typically requires millennia to develop. How long has humanity been refining these systems? Approximately 12,000 standard years, Chen replied casually. Though the pace of development has accelerated significantly over the past millennium as our communication and transportation technologies improved. The chamber fell silent as representatives processed the implications of Chen's statement. Most galactic civilizations achieved cultural unity through conquest, assimilation, or gradual homogenization. Humans had apparently spent 12 millennia perfecting the art of unity through diversity. Admiral, Chancellor Mordek said slowly, are you suggesting that human civilization is actually a confederation of distinct species? Not species, Chen corrected. Cultural groups. All humans share common biology, but our societies developed along thousands of different evolutionary paths. We've learned to treat cultural differences as strategic advantages rather than obstacles to overcome. Zektar felt understanding begin to crystallize in his mind. Human tactical flexibility wasn't the result of advanced military training. It was the natural outcome of a civilization that had spent millennia learning to think from thousands of different perspectives simultaneously. This is why your military forces adapt so quickly to new opponents, he said aloud, drawing surprised attention from around the chamber. You're not learning new ways of thinking. You're accessing existing frameworks developed by different human cultures. Chen's smile grew warmer. Observer Zektar demonstrates excellent analytical capabilities. Yes, human military effectiveness derives from our ability to approach problems using multiple cultural perspectives simultaneously. Every challenge we encounter has likely been addressed by at least one human society over a long history. The implications were staggering. Other species developed military doctrine through institutional learning that required generations to refine. Humans could access 12,000 years of refined strategic thinking through their existing cultural diversity. Admiral, Thrakvin's voice carried through the chamber's communication system from his remote location. What you're describing suggests that humanity possesses a form of collective intelligence that far exceeds individual capabilities. That's correct, Admiral. Human civilization functions as a vast problem-solving network where individual cultures contribute specialized perspectives to address complex challenges. Our success against the Kethmori Empire wasn't the result of superior technology or tactics. It was the result of applying 12 millennia of collective strategic experience to a new problem set. Counselor Vexthal's translation device struggled with the emotional harmonics in his voice. Admiral Chun, if humanity possesses this level of collective intelligence, why did you require coalition assistance against the Kethmori? Chin's expression remained pleasant, but Zektar noticed a subtle shift in her bearing that suggested the question had touched on something significant. Counselor, we didn't require assistance. We requested collaboration. Is there a difference? A substantial one. Assistance implies dependence. One party helping another achieve objectives they couldn't accomplish alone. Collaboration implies mutual benefit. Multiple parties working together to achieve objectives that serve everyone's interests. The distinction sent chills through Zektar's circulatory system. Humans hadn't joined the coalition because they needed help fighting the Kethmori. They had joined because they saw an opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities to potential future partners. What did humanity gain from this collaboration? Chancellor Mordek asked. Knowledge, Chen replied simply. This conflict provided us with comprehensive data on galactic military capabilities, political structures, economic systems, and cultural frameworks. Information that will be invaluable for future collaborative projects. The casual admission that humans had used the war as an intelligence-gathering operation struck the chamber like a physical blow. Representatives exchanged glances that carried currents of unease, uncertainty, and growing fear. Admiral, Thrakvin's voice carried a note of careful control. Are you suggesting that humanity viewed this conflict as a learning opportunity? Admiral Thrakvin, humans view everything as a learning opportunity. It's how our civilization has survived and prospered for 12,000 years. Zektar found himself studying the faces of representatives around the chamber. He could see understanding dawning in their expressions, the realization that they had invited something unprecedented into their galactic community. Admiral Chun, he said carefully, what are humanity's long-term objectives regarding the coalition? Chen's smile grew slightly wider. Observer Zektar, humanity's objectives are simple. Optimal outcomes for all participants in galactic civilization. We want every species to achieve their maximum potential within sustainable collaborative frameworks. And if a species' maximum potential conflicts with galactic stability, then we help them find better ways to achieve their goals. Chen replied with that same unsettling calm. Our experience suggests that most conflicts arise from inefficient resource allocation or inadequate communication rather than fundamental incompatibilities. The response was perfectly reasonable and completely terrifying. Humans weren't offering partnership. They were offering management. They saw the galaxy as a complex system that could be optimized through proper administration. What happens to species that resist optimization? Chancellor Mordek asked. Chen's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Chancellor, we found that most species make rational decisions when provided with complete information about their options. Resistance typically indicates incomplete understanding rather than genuine disagreement. The chamber fell silent as representatives contemplated the implications of Chen's words. Zektar felt a deep understanding settling over him like a heavy weight. The galaxy had assumed that humanity would be content to remain a junior member of the coalition, grateful for acceptance and willing to follow established protocols. Instead, they had encountered a civilization that saw the coalition itself as a problem to be solved, and they were already implementing their solution. Admiral, Zektar said quietly, when you say optimal outcomes for all participants, who determines what constitutes optimal? Chen's smile became genuinely warm for the first time in their acquaintance. Observer Zektar, that's exactly the right question. And the answer is, everyone does through collaborative frameworks that ensure all perspectives are considered in decision-making processes. But someone has to coordinate those frameworks. Yes, Chen agreed. Someone does. The weight of that admission settled over the chamber like a shroud. The galaxy had thought it was gaining a powerful ally in humanity. Now, as Zektar looked around at the faces of representatives who were beginning to understand what they had invited into their midst, he realized they had actually chosen their future administrators. And the most terrifying part was that the humans might actually be right about optimization being necessary for galactic survival. 6 months after Admiral Chen's presentation to the Coalition High Command, Zektar stood once again at the viewing port of Station Nexus 7, watching ships move through the void with patterns that had become hauntingly familiar. The Kethmori integration was complete, but what he observed now bore no resemblance to traditional post-conflict reconstruction. The former enemy empire hadn't been occupied or absorbed. It had been transformed into something entirely new. Kethmori worlds hummed with activity as crystalline beings worked alongside human administrators to implement technologies that neither species could have developed alone. Trade routes that had been severed by warfare now carried unprecedented volumes of goods, information, and cultural exchange. Sir, Vashti's voice carried a note of wonder that had become common in coalition communications. The productivity reports from integrated sectors are extraordinary. Resource efficiency has increased by over 300%. Conflict incidents have decreased to near zero, and satisfaction indices across all species show dramatic improvement. Zektar studied the data streams flowing across his displays. The numbers were undeniably impressive, but they told a story that made his exoskeleton tingle with unease. Humanity hadn't conquered the Kethmori. They had optimized them. Vashti compare current Kethmori productivity with their pre-war baseline. The analysis appeared on his screen, confirming his growing suspicions. Former enemy populations weren't just more productive. They were more productive than they had ever been under their own governance. Human optimization protocols had identified and eliminated inefficiencies that the Kethmori themselves had never recognized. Admiral Throckven's image appeared on the communication screen, his expression reflecting the mixture of admiration and concern that had become standard among coalition leadership. The Brutari commander had aged visibly over the past months as the implications of human capabilities became increasingly clear. "Observer Zektar," he said without preamble, "I've received an invitation from Admiral Chen. She's requesting a meeting to discuss expansion of integration protocols to additional coalition sectors." Expansion. Voluntary integration for any species interested in optimizing their administrative frameworks. She's offering to share human organizational technologies with the entire coalition. Zektar felt his secondary heart skip. The offer was perfectly reasonable and absolutely terrifying. Humans were proposing to voluntarily share technologies that could revolutionize galactic civilization, but he was beginning to understand that human gifts came with invisible strings attached. "Sir, have any species accepted this offer?" 17 so far, Throckven replied, his voice carrying complex harmonics of defeat. The Altarians' 3 Xylorian colony clusters, the entire Draconic Merchant Guild, and 14 smaller civilizations. All report dramatic improvements in efficiency and quality of life. And the cost. That's what concerns me. There doesn't appear to be a cost. Humans provide consultation, implementation support, and ongoing technical assistance without requesting payment, territorial concessions, or political commitments. The absence of visible costs made the arrangement more unsettling rather than less. Zektar had studied human history extensively over the past months, and one pattern had emerged with crystal clarity. Humans never acted without strategic objectives. Their generosity always served larger purposes. "Admiral, I think we need to understand that humans operate on timescales that exceed our normal planning horizons. What appears to be cost-free assistance today may be part of strategies that won't become apparent for decades or centuries." "What are you suggesting?" "That humans aren't optimizing individual species or sectors. They're optimizing galactic civilization itself. Every integration project provides them with more data, more influence, and more opportunity to shape future development." Before Throckven could respond, new communications began flooding into Station Nexus 7 from across the galaxy. Zektar's displays lit up with reports that made him question the fundamental assumptions underlying galactic politics. The Rigelian Confederacy had just announced voluntary integration with human administrative frameworks after their traditional government had struggled to address a resource distribution crisis. The human solution had resolved the crisis within weeks and improved overall system efficiency by orders of magnitude. The Tau Ceti Mining Consortium had requested human assistance with labor disputes that had been escalating for decades. Human mediators had not only resolved the conflicts, but had implemented new frameworks that turned former adversaries into collaborative partners. Most significantly, the Vegan Republic had invited human advisors to help redesign their entire economic system after observing the success of integrated sectors. "They're not conquering the galaxy," Zektar said slowly as understanding crystallized in his mind. "They're making themselves indispensable to it." "Explain." "Admiral, traditional conquest requires maintaining control through force, which is expensive and unstable. Humans are creating conditions where other species voluntarily seek their assistance because human solutions genuinely produce better outcomes." Thrakvin studied tactical displays that showed human influence spreading across galactic civilization like a benevolent infection. "Observer, are you suggesting that humans plan this expansion from the beginning?" "I'm suggesting that humans don't plan for specific outcomes. They create conditions that make optimal outcomes inevitable. They've made their assistance so valuable that refusing it becomes economically and politically irrational." Admiral Chen's image appeared on their communication channel with the perfect timing that had become characteristic of human interventions. She looked exactly as calm and composed as always, though Zektar now recognized the subtle signs of satisfaction in her bearing. "Admiral Thrakvin, Observer Zektar," she said with her characteristic warm smile, "I wanted to thank you for your observations and insights during our recent operations. Your perspectives have been valuable for refining our collaborative frameworks." "Admiral Chun," Thrakvin said carefully, "the Coalition High Command has been reviewing the integration results across multiple sectors. The improvements are remarkable. We're pleased that our assistance has been beneficial. Collaboration produces better outcomes for everyone involved." Zektar found himself studying Chen's expression with new understanding. The human admiral wasn't just satisfied with the success of integration projects. She was pleased with how predictably the galaxy was responding to human optimization. "Admiral," he said slowly, "how long have humans been planning galactic integration?" Chen's smile grew slightly wider. "Observer Zektar, humans don't plan integration. We create conditions that make integration beneficial for all parties. It's a natural process that emerges from optimal resource allocation and communication frameworks. But you anticipated this expansion. We anticipated that rational beings would make rational decisions when presented with opportunities to improve their circumstances. The specific timeline and scope were determined by how quickly various species recognized the benefits of collaboration." The casual admission that humans had engineered the galaxy's voluntary transformation sent chills through Zektar's exoskeleton. They hadn't conquered civilization. They had optimized it into choosing them as administrators. "What happens next?" Thrakvin asked. Chen's expression became thoughtful. "Admiral, humanity's long-term objective is the development of a truly galactic civilization, one that maximizes the potential of every species while maintaining sustainable resource utilization and peaceful coexistence. And humanity's role in this galactic civilization? Whatever role proves most beneficial for achieving optimal outcomes. If that means administrative coordination, we're prepared to serve in that capacity. If other arrangements prove more effective, we're flexible." Zektar felt a deep understanding settling over him. Humans weren't seeking power for its own sake. They were seeking optimal solutions to the problem of galactic governance. Their willingness to serve as administrators wasn't altruism. It was the logical result of their unique capabilities for large-scale optimization. "Admiral Chun," he said quietly, "what happens to species that prefer their traditional governance systems?" Chen's expression remained pleasant, but something calculating flickered in her eyes. "Observer, our experience suggests that most preferences for traditional systems arise from incomplete information about available alternatives. We've found that comprehensive education about optimization benefits typically resolves these preferences. And if education doesn't resolve them, then we respect those choices while continuing to demonstrate the advantages of collaboration. We've found that practical examples are often more persuasive than theoretical arguments." The response was perfectly reasonable and absolutely chilling. Humans would respect the right of species to reject optimization while simultaneously making that rejection economically and politically unsustainable. "One final question," Zektar said. "When you first encountered the Coalition, did you anticipate that your involvement would lead to galaxy-wide transformation?" Chen's smile became genuinely warm. "Observer Zektar, humans encountered the coalition at a time when galactic civilization was approaching several critical inefficiency thresholds. Resource allocation disparities, communication barriers, and conflict escalation patterns suggested that major systemic changes were inevitable. We simply position ourselves to ensure those changes produced optimal outcomes. The admission that humans had recognized galactic civilization as a failing system and positioned themselves to manage its transition sent a final chill through Zektar's consciousness. The galaxy hadn't chosen human leadership. It had been carefully guided into making that choice. As Chen's transmission ended, Zektar found himself staring out at the void, where ships moved in patterns that had once seemed random, but now revealed themselves as components of a vast, coordinated system. Humanity had entered the galactic community as junior partners and had become its inevitable administrators through a combination of tactical brilliance, strategic patience, and an understanding of civilization that no other species had achieved. "Admiral," he said to Thrakven, "I think we need to accept that the galaxy we knew is gone. The question isn't whether humans will control galactic civilization. They already do. The question is whether that control will prove beneficial for everyone involved." Thrakven studied the displays, showing human influence spreading across known space like a carefully orchestrated transformation. "And what's your assessment?" Zektar considered the data he had compiled over months of observation. Resource efficiency was up across all integrated sectors. Conflict had virtually disappeared in areas under human administration. Quality of life indices showed consistent improvement across all species participating in optimization programs. "My assessment is that humans are probably right about the benefits of optimization. And that terrifies me more than any conquest could." The truth was that humanity had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. They had made themselves genuinely indispensable to the functioning of interstellar civilization, not through force or coercion, but by proving that their methods produced better outcomes than any alternative. As Zektar watched the endless dance of ships carrying goods, information, and beings across the galaxy according to patterns designed by human administrators, he realized that every species in the galaxy had learned to fear humanity, not because they were conquerors, but because they were optimizers. And resistance to optimization was becoming increasingly irrational with each passing day.